So with Republicans leading in the latest polls in Montana against Jon Tester, I think it's fairly safe to say that Republicans will capture the Senate in 2024. Now, they're already at 50 seats if you flip West Virginia, which is going to go Republican with Jim Justice being the nominee and Joe Manchin being out of the race. So that already would give Republicans the Senate under a Republican White House. But flipping Montana or Ohio just ensures that no matter who wins the presidential contest, Republicans will hold the Senate. And so far, it looks very safe to say that Republicans will win in the state of Montana, which puts them at 51 seats. So we're going to talk about the Montana Senate race, as well as some of the other toss-up Senate races across the country, places like Ohio and Arizona, because we're going to talk about what strategies have worked for the GOP, why they're doing so well in Montana, and why they're not doing so well in places like Ohio and Arizona, states that, based on the national polls, they should be very competitive in, and in Ohio, they should be leading by several points. So we're going to talk about that and more in just a second, but first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So first, of course, to Montana, Tim Sheehy, the Republican challenger to Jon Tester, currently is in the lead by 5 points. Jon Tester's struggling to get 45% of the vote in some of these polls. Tim Sheehy breaks 50 in 3 of them. So that's very, very good news for the Republican Party. And Montana should really not be a competitive state. It's really just because you have a very popular Democratic incumbent in a state where he's overstayed his welcome. If we go back to 2020, Donald Trump won Montana by over 16 percentage points, and it's very unlikely in that scenario that somebody like Jon Tester is going to hold on. Now, the reason for that also is because Tim Sheehy is a very strong candidate. He's a military veteran. He's somebody that fits the state very well, and he's not somebody who's campaigning on some extreme message or some fringe conspiracies like Kari Lake, for example. There's a reason why Tim Sheehy is leading in the polls in his Senate race, and somebody like Kari Lake is losing by over 8 points. So there is a candidate quality aspect to this as well. So thankfully for the GOP, they found a very strong recruit in Montana, and they're likely to win the Senate as a result. So with Montana off the board for Democrats, the only true toss-up state that's left for them to win is Ohio. Now, currently in Ohio, Sherrod Brown is up by 5 points against Bernie Moreno. Now, Bernie Moreno is a pretty weak candidate. He's had a number of gaffes, and in some cases, some of his fringe policy positions have been put on blast. But, thankfully for him, Ohio is a pretty red state at this point. Donald Trump won here by 8 points. And Sherrod Brown is going to have to share the ballot with Donald Trump, which I certainly think is going to be hard for him, because it's very hard for any down-ballot candidate in today's partisan climate to outrun the top of the ticket by 8 points. So given if Donald Trump wins Ohio by the same margin he did in 2020 and 2016, roughly, Bernie Moreno would probably win very narrowly by 1 or 2 points. That being said, I think this was very avoidable. Republicans could have run a much stronger candidate, somebody like Matt Dolan or even Frank LaRose. Bernie Moreno has no experience in elected office. Frank LaRose is Secretary of State, and Matt Dolan also has some experience in statewide politics. So it really would have been, I think, a safer bet to go with either of those candidates, because I guarantee you at this point in time, they probably would have been tied or leading in the polls in Ohio, and it would have been one less race for the Republicans to seriously worry about, because Republicans are pouring millions and millions of dollars into this Senate race because Bernie Moreno is such a weak candidate, and because Sherrod Brown is not going to be easy to beat this time around, just in general, because he is a strong incumbent. Now, if we look at the rest of the races on this board, Wisconsin is a state where Republicans have been struggling to gain traction. Tammy Baldwin is up against her Republican opponent by over 6 points. She was also going to be a very tough candidate to beat. Now, the interesting thing about Wisconsin is that unlike Ohio and Montana, which are expected to go safely Republican or likely Republican, Wisconsin is a presidential battleground, and Kamala Harris has a narrow lead in the state. So, even if Donald Trump were to win Wisconsin narrowly, the polling is saying that Tammy Baldwin would still hold on, which is one of the reasons why I have this state as lean Democrat. Because even if Donald Trump wins here in Wisconsin, there's going to be Trump Baldwin voters or independent Baldwin voters that are going to put her over the finish line. And Michigan is just a very tough state for Republicans overall. That's another state where the Republican Party is down by, I believe, over 5 points. Alyssa Slotkin is going up against Mike Rogers. Now, Rogers is, I guess, a better candidate because he's polling better than somebody like even Bernie Moreno in a much redder state. So you could argue he's somewhat of a better candidate for Republicans to field. But ultimately, whatever way you splice it, the Rust Belt is going to be very difficult for Republicans to break through. And that's mainly just because this is a historically Democratic region in general. And by default, states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin choose Democrats over Republicans no matter what. So that's always the default, and Republicans need to sort of run exceptional campaigns under the right circumstances to break through. That's how Donald Trump won in 2016. He had the right message at the right time, and the Democrats put up a very weak candidate. Now, the Senate battleground map didn't need to be this limiting. For example, Arizona could have also been in the toss-up category. You have a very progressive Democrat in Ruben Gallego, but the Republican electorate, backed by Donald Trump, chose Kari Lake, who was perhaps the worst candidate to run in the state as a whole. Not only does she have very bad optics with all of her failed court cases regarding the election or conspiracy theories and just her unquestioning worship of Donald Trump, but that's also a very bad model to run in a swing state in general, because voters are looking for somebody who's actually going to reach across the aisle and try to at least appeal to suburban voters. And Kari Lake has failed to do that. Kari Lake has run basically just a base-centric campaign, only focusing on issues to rile up the base. And as seen in 2022, that's not a winning strategy. If it was, you'd have Governor Doug Mastriano by now. So this is a very poor strategy in politics. Every state, even redder states, places like Montana and Ohio, you have to sort of reach out to those voters in the middle, because even though they vote for Republicans by a majority in presidential contests, their picks down ballot could be very different. And in Arizona, this is not exactly a state where Republicans have been doing very well as of late. In 2022, Kari Lake lost the governor's race. Republicans lost the Senate race there. And in 2020, they lost all of the federal offices as well. So Arizona's been trending to the left already, and Republicans decided to go with the most MAGA type candidate. And that's been a brand that basically has completely destroyed the Arizona GOP. Those types of candidates are not electable in Arizona. So this was basically a throwaway race by Republicans. The NRSC basically made concessions to Donald Trump. In exchange for backing Kari Lake, Donald Trump would endorse candidates like Tim Sheehy and Dave McCormick, candidates that had a much better shot at winning. But the contrary was Republicans essentially had to give up on Arizona. Now, some of the polls here are a bit skewed. Fox has Kari Lake down by 15 points. I don't think she's going to lose by that much of a margin, but she's certainly not going to win. And that's why I made a video several months ago saying Kari Lake would lose her Senate race. And I think it's a guarantee. I think there's really no chance that she wins. She has no appeal to any voters outside the MAGA Republican base. And even though Ruben Gallego is a weak candidate in his own right for his very fringe progressive positions, and those are positions that normally get rejected in Arizona, see the 2018 race for governor, for example, he just lucked out by getting a very unelectable and bad opponent. So that's one race that I think Republicans really could have actually tried to put a better candidate forth. But, under our scenario, it's probably likely Democrat at this point in time. Kari Lake probably loses by 6 points or so. Nevada, you have Sam Brown, who's a relative unknown candidate. He ran in 2022, but his message really isn't breaking through. Jackie Rosen is also just a stronger candidate than Catherine Cortez Masto overall. So I think that this race really isn't going to be that competitive. I think it's going to narrow up considerably, though. I don't think she's going to win by 10 points, but she'll probably win by 5 or 6 points. And that'll obviously give Democrats that Senate seat. So Republicans are really just stuck with a low ceiling because of their losses in the 2022 midterms. Because had Republicans won Pennsylvania, had they won Georgia, had they won Arizona, had they won Nevada, they would have had 4 more Senate seats than they currently have, which would have put them at 53 Senate seats by default. And that's excluding, or 52 rather, and that's excluding Montana and West Virginia. So that would have put Republicans in a much stronger position. Capturing Ohio, West Virginia, and Montana would have put them at 55 Senate seats. So you would have seen an incredible margin for Republicans in the Senate, and they probably would have held on to the chamber for the rest of the decade. But now Republicans are only likely to hold the Senate very narrowly. Now, the good news for Republicans is that in 2026, if Kamala Harris does win the presidential election, there are a number of pickup opportunities that they could have. For example, Republicans could flip Georgia by running someone like Brian Kemp against Jon Ossoff, and that's a race we're actually going to talk about later on this week, because Brian Kemp's approval ratings are through the roof right now, and he would be a very formidable opponent to Jon Ossoff, and dare I say, he'd probably be favored to win in that contest. You have Georgia, you have Arizona, You have Michigan. You potentially have Virginia under the right circumstances with, Glenn Youngkin in an off year where Kamala is unpopular. So there's a number of pickup opportunities for the GOP in 2026 if Kamala Harris wins the White House. So it's not all doom and gloom for Republicans this time around. I mean, they should be lucky that they're winning the Senate at all. But of course, they're making it very hard for themselves by running candidates like Bernie Moreno, Carrie Lake. The Republicans certainly need to clamp down on running more fringe candidates. Clearly, something has to be done to sort of rein in these extreme candidates that have no chance of winning. The Democrats are much better at doing that than the Republicans. But anyway, that's it for today's video. As it stands right now, Republicans probably on track to get 52 Senate seats, but that really is their hard ceiling. There's really no other place they could break through except barring maybe Michigan under some sort of miracle. But that's really where the Senate stands as of today. But, that does give Republicans the Senate, even if it is by a small majority. So anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell notification so you miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.